And I appreciate the invitation from all of you. You are an important organization for our state, and you as an organization and certainly individually, the work you do is critical to California's economy, to everything that we do. And I know that it's been a rough period of time for you, your companies, and your employees, and hopefully, as the governor says, we are on the mend. So I appreciate the introduction, and yes, I've worked a long time as a lawyer and in the public and private sector, and I'm finally an executive secretary, so I'm really... It's one of the things that I've learned working for Jerry Brown is that it's not always easy to explain the thinking, and so but he really, I think, in looking at how he wanted a governor's office to run, it's not always easy to explain the thinking, but once you understand it, it's usually this side of smart, sometimes verging on brilliant. And in terms of a little thing like titles, he really wanted to signal a change in the governor's office and be very clear that this governor is the one in charge. And so we've got a small, lean, but mean staff that supports him. And I am the executive secretary. And we've got an executive secretary in charge of our legal affairs, who's a terrific person, Jim Humes, who on some issues you may well come in contact with. But we've cut the governor's office by directive of the governor by at least 25%. I think we've cut it even more. I know that makes, at times, the work of some of your folks here in Sacramento who work with the governor's office a little tougher because there are fewer people to see. But I think in the end, again, going back to that Jerry Brown thinking, it actually, I think, really makes things work better because you know who you need to see on things, and you can't kind of forum shop and then have a lot of confusion. And ultimately, again, there's one decision maker. I want to just take a couple of minutes to talk about sort of where we see things, where we've been and where we see things. But I want to do it in a really quick fashion, so I won't cover really that much, because I'd love, if we could, to just open it up. Because what I'd really love to do is hear your questions, your comments, your concerns. That's really far more valuable, and then if there are things that I haven't talked about, you can ask about them, and I'm happy to cover them, and maybe we can do with that in short order. Clearly, when the governor took office a little over a year ago, the state was in really bad shape. And as you've heard him, I'm sure, say, we had over a $26 billion budget deficit. It's now under $10 billion. It's about $9 billion. And really, in terms of the structural deficit of the budget, it was $20 billion a year ago, and it's $5 billion. So the first thing that I want to reinforce, and I say it over and over again, is that people who think that we actually haven't made real cuts in state government don't know what's going on here. We have cut real things. Our CalWorks grants to folks are down to the levels they were in 1983. We have cut departments and agencies. We've merged. We have a reorganization proposal on the table for this year, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we have cut billions of dollars out of state government. And we can't stop where we stopped last year. As you know, the governor had a balanced budget plan last year that was a combination of cuts and revenues. We didn't get the revenue portion of the package that we wanted to put before the voters. So we did a budget that was mostly cuts with some borrowing, not any real of the real kinds of gimmicks or things that the governor rejected. And if you remember, people forget this already, but he vetoed the legislature's budget last year because it didn't stand up to a test that he'd set in terms of being a real budget with not a lot of gimmicks and honest budgeting. He's put a budget on the table this year, and that's, by the way, what we focused our primary attention on last year. One reason, because it was the biggest problem facing the state. And it's not only about the state budget, but it bleeds into everything. It bleeds into the state's credit rating. It bleeds into whether or not we can actually even issue bonds that the voters have approved, because we can't keep going deeper into debt if we don't have a way of paying off that debt. And I know that impacts you, and that's a major motivator for one of the reasons why we really believe that we've got to be the kind of fiscal stewards that we're trying to be, and the governor is certainly leading on, because the only way that we're going to be able to get over this hump is to be able to increase investment in the state, put more money out, have more big public works projects, and we're not going to be able to do that if we're billions of dollars in debt. We cannot, and I know that you've seen this, continue issuing bonds when we don't have the money to pay the debt service. So that's a major motivator, in addition to just needing to get the state back on the right fiscal track. We spent a lot of time on that last year, and we also spent a lot of time trying to put the government together, bring the right people in. We still have a lot of work to do in that regard, but we're making, I think, really good progress. This year, if you've heard, the governor said job number one again is to keep the state on a good fiscal path. And a lot of people may think that's about the governor introducing a budget and then later on, when the budget gets passed, figuring out what you're going to do with it. But I have seen over the last year, and continue to see even in this first month of this year, that the job of being a good fiscal steward is a daily job. And just like you and your companies know, that's what you have to keep. You have to keep your eye on that bottom line ball, and you need to make sure that that's something you're looking at and presiding over in each and every day. Same thing with the governor. Lots of people have lots of ideas for spending money and getting the state into obligations that cost money. And we spend a lot of our time in this governor's office saying no and preventing things from happening. Those things don't always show up in the newspapers or get published in legislative reports. But believe me, we spend a lot of time with people saying, you're not going to get that through. We're not going to have this agency go off and start that new initiative or that new project. We're not going to sign that bill. We're going to blue line that out of the budget if you put it in. So fiscal stewardship, continuing to get the state back into the shape that we should be, having a balanced budget, a real balanced budget, and no structural deficit. And the governor has a plan to do that. It's more cuts this year, deep cuts this year, and continuing our criminal justice prison realignment program that's trying to move some responsibilities to the local level where we feel like they, A, can be better done, and B, can be done more cheaply, and C, allows us to be able to get out from under a Supreme Court order that says we've got to just get thousands and thousands of prisoners out of our state prisons. It's actually another one of those things that doesn't really get a lot of attention in terms of the huge lift that it was, but prison realignment is a major, major reform that requires constant attention, and the governor is spending lots and lots of time on it, and it is working. As you probably have also heard, the governor has, in his proposed budget, has said we need more cuts, but we can't get this budget to add up without new revenue. We spent a lot of time looking at what kind of revenue package that we would propose, and the governor made a couple of decisions. One, he said he doesn't want to be hostage to the legislature on this. It'd be great if we could get it through the legislature. We did not do so last year. He's always said he wants the voters to have the final say over whether or not there are increased taxes, and so he's leading a charge to go directly to the voters. Second decision he made is that he wanted to have a balanced tax package, and as low a tax package as we needed to be able to get out of the hole we're in. So he's proposed a tax package that raises the personal income tax for folks making over $500,000 up to over $1 million by either 1% or 2%, and then a half-cent sales increase. Over a year ago, we were paying a penny more in sales tax than we're paying now. He's now proposing to kind of recoup a half cent of that. So he's proposing less than what we were paying just over a year ago. The total of those two things should bring in about $6.9 billion in the first year, and then about 6.5 years after. He also made the decision that it should be a temporary tax package, and so it's a 5-year tax package. With those revenues and sustaining the cuts that he made last year and ones that we are proposing this year, we get the state out of not only, we don't only get a balanced budget for this year, but we eliminate the structural deficit and we actually start paying down some debt. So we believe that he has the right path to get California on the straight and narrow in terms of our finances. He's spending a lot of time trying to talk directly to people and businesses and all kinds of citizens in California about why he's doing this and the need. He believes that this is something that the leading lights of California need to join him on supporting, and he thinks it's the real and right answer for California. It's not the only answer, and he's proposed some other things like pension reform. He has a 12-point pension plan that he likes to say. He's presented it in his State of the State address to the legislature the other day. And while they clapped on lots of things, there wasn't, those of you who might have seen it or were in the chambers might have noticed that for some reason pension reform didn't get a lot of applause by, not only not by the Democrats, but not by the Republicans either, who really talk a lot about pension reform. He's serious about pension reform. He's sort of taking on that issue, and lots of his friends and allies are not happy about it, but he believes that is the next big problem that's coming down the pike for California. As he said last night at the LA Chamber, the cracks in the dam are really showing, and it's going to burst unless somebody's willing to take it on and take it on in a serious way. So that's another one that we'd love people to stand with us on. We're going to have to try to get that through the legislature one way or another, but that's one. If we don't get through the legislature, we're going to have to ultimately go to the ballot and get help on pension reform. There have been some pension reform efforts out there, and they actually haven't been able to pick up a lot of steam and certainly haven't been able to pick up a lot of financial support. A lot of people throw pension reform in a list of things they want to see done in California. But there hasn't actually been a lot of oomph or a lot of support for getting it done. So he's been willing to take it on. You've probably also heard that while he continues to talk about the fact that we need to focus on the budget and do those things, he also thinks it's not a time to just hunker down and look internally, but we also have to think big. We have to think smart, but we have to think big. And that's why high-speed rail and water, and the water project and dealing with our water problems once and for all are two other big issues he's willing to take on. In addition to, we've got education issues that he's focused on. We've got things in government, including more regulatory reform. A number of you, I think, have heard him talk about CEQA reform as something, and he signed 2 bills last year. We're working on CEQA reform for specific kinds of projects, but they're things that he's willing and think is important to take on for not just California's economy, but for the good of the state, to be able to make some significant changes. And at the bottom line, he doesn't say this, but I will. He's the person that can get these things done, sort of the old Nixon to China kind of thing. I mean, he's willing to pull his friends along who are unwilling to do things like pension reform and CEQA reform and regulatory reform. We saw some of that last year, and he's going to continue to hold the line. The last thing I'll say is last year's legislative session, his first, I think, probably was in some ways a mixed bag for you. I think he signed and vetoed bills that you were concerned about. Some you liked and some you didn't. I want to make sure that you know that we want to make sure that we have an open door and always want to make sure that we're hearing from you. We know your priorities. We know your concerns.